All right, so this is going to be over section 6.4, which is adding and subtracting rational expressions. And it's very similar to when you add and subtract fractions normally, as far as when you have to get least common denominator to begin with. All right, so you may not quite understand or you don't see where that common denominator is. So what you might want to do on something like this is go ahead and break it down. All right, so 12 breaks down to, let's see, 2 times 6, right? So 2 times 6. And then we could break it down to a 2 times, and 6 is 2 times 3. All right, and 15 is 3 times 5. And that's broken down to prime numbers, so we don't have to go any further. Now remember, then you take the most of each number, all right, in each of these. So here we have 2 2s. So for our least common denominator, we're going to have 2 2s. And then we have 1 3 here and 1 3 here. So the most we have in one of those terms is 3. And then we have a 5. So that's going to be the least common denominator, all right? So let's multiply it together. So 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 times 5 is 60. So both of those will go into 60. So when we do this now, so we're going to get a common denominator of 60. So what do I have to multiply 12 by to get 60? Well, 12 times 5. So if I multiply the denominator times 5, we multiply the numerator times 5. So that's where this comes from right here. And then we bring the sign down. 15 times what equals 60? Well, 15 times 4. So then I multiply the top times 4. So 1 times 4 is 4. So what we get here when we add that together is 9 over 60. And then we want to reduce that down. So we can divide both of those by a 3. So that equals 3/20. So don't forget, you do want to reduce your fractions down if you can do that. Okay. All right, so let's look over here. This one now has a variable. So we get our least common denominator in this case, which is going to be 3 and 4. So what is the smallest number both 3 and 4 can go into? 12. And then they have one y, so we bring a y down. That's our least common denominator. Now what do I have to multiply this by to get this? Well, I have the y, but if I multiply it times 4, that's where I get the 12. So I have to multiply that by 4. So then I have to multiply the numerator by 4, which gives us 8. I'm just going to put this all over one denominator. All right, bring the sign down. So what do I have to multiply 4 by to get 12? I have the y, so I'm going to multiply this by 3. Multiply the numerator by 3. So that's 3 over 12y. So now add your numerator, 11 over 12y. And that's how you add rational expressions, okay? And if you can simplify it, you want to be sure you simplify there. All right, so looking here at this one, so before we can do anything, notice, let me see, sorry about that, get this to, there we go. This is a difference of squares. All right, this is a difference of squares right here. So we have to factor that out. Square root of 1, and then we have a +1 and a -1 in any order. All right, so now let's look at a least common denominator here. So if we need a least common denominator, we have an x + 1 and an x - 1. Here I have 1 x + 1, which I've already written down, so I don't have to write it again. It's just finding the most in each one. All right, so what do I have to multiply this by? Let me turn this light on to see if that helps a little bit, gives you a little bit, there we go. What do I have to multiply this by to get this? Well, it's exactly the same, so I don't have to change anything. I just bring that 2x down. Bring the sign down. All right, so here, what do I need to multiply this by to get this? Because I'm getting a common denominator, that's why I'm doing this. Well, I'm missing an x - 1. So I have to multiply that times an x - 1. That means I have to multiply the numerator times an x - 1. So in this case, we're going to distribute this -1 through. So what's a -1 times x? I'm going to put it in parentheses. A negative x. And what's a -1 times a -1? a positive 1. Right? So what that looks like in a numerator, if I drop the parentheses, is a 2x. Okay, we have a positive times a negative here, so that just becomes a negative, x plus 1. Okay. And so 2x minus x, let me put that over the denominator here. All right, so 2x minus x is 1x, so that equals a positive x plus 1. Okay, if I combine this, over an x plus 1, x minus 1. Well, these then, x plus 1 goes into here once, x plus 1 goes into here once. Those cancel out. So remember, you got to keep that 1 in the numerator over x minus 1. So that's what we end up with as an answer. Okay. All right, so let's look over here. This one, both of these we're going to have to factor out before we can get a least common denominator. So let's go ahead and take the time to factor those out. What factors of 6 that I can add to get 5? Factors of a positive 6. So here we want to have a plus 3 and a plus 2. Those multiply to a positive 6, add to a positive 5. All right, over here, we need factors that multiply to a negative 3. Well, we know 3 and 1, those are the only options. We need it to be a positive 2 when we add these together. So that means we need a positive 3 and a negative 1. And then check that to be sure. 3 times a negative 1 is a negative 3. Positive 3 minus 1 is a positive 2, just to be sure you did that correctly. Okay, now we're done with those. All right, so let's get a least common denominator here. So we have an x plus 3, x plus 2. And over here we have an x plus 3, which I don't have to write down again. And then we have an x minus 1. All right, so let's get that common denominator. So right here, what am I missing? Well, I have the x plus 3, I have the x plus 2, but I don't have the x minus 1. So that's what I have to multiply this by. That means I have to also multiply the numerator by that. And then we're going to distribute. So 2x times x is 2x squared. And 2x times a negative 1 is a negative 2x. All right, let's look at this one. So x plus 3 we have, and x minus 1 we have, but what I'm missing is an x plus 2. So I'm going to multiply this times an x plus 2, which means, put parentheses around that, I'm going to multiply this times an x plus 2. So that means we have to distribute, FOIL, however, use your box method, whatever it is, to multiply those two binomials together. All right, so x times x is x squared. X times 2 is a positive 2x. 1 times x is a positive 1x. 1 times 2 is a positive 2. Now let's combine like terms. So 2x squared plus 1x squared is 3x squared. Remember, we're adding, so we don't do anything with the powers. They have to be like terms, like variables, like powers. All right, negative 2x and a positive 2x, well, those cancel out. So I'm left with just a positive 1x. Again, you don't have to show that one. If you do, it's completely fine. And then we have a plus 2. Okay, so 3x squared plus 1x plus 2. Our denominator. All right, well, we don't know if anything factors out there. And so we want to see if there's something that we can do on that problem to see that if we can cancel or not cancel, since we don't know. Okay, so what we're going to do is look at the here to see if we can factor this. So recognize if this is greater than 1, then we would need to use the AC method. And so if we use the AC method, we're going to take 3 times 2, and that gives us 6, right? So what factors of 6, positive 6, can we combine to get a positive 1x? Well, normally we would think, well, 3 and 2, right? We could have a positive 3 and a negative 2, and that gives us a positive 1x. But when I multiply that back together, it gives us a negative 6. So that does not work. And 1 and 6 won't work. We can't get a 1 from that. So this is your answer. It can't be reduced anymore. All right, so let's move on to this next problem. This is number 5 on your study guide sheet. These are just the bottom examples that I'm doing on this sheet, okay? So this is the one, notice how we always want to write our variable first. So we're going to rewrite this as a negative y plus 2. Then we want to, because we don't want that leading term to be negative, we're going to factor out a negative 1 or negative, it's the same thing. And that leaves us with y minus 2. Okay. So negative y divided by negative 1 is y. 2 divided by negative 1 is a negative 2. And really it's changing the signs of both of those in the parentheses. So now what I have here is I have y over y minus 2 plus 8 over a negative y minus 2. So this is like a negative 1. So I can show it as a negative 1 if we want to. So before you get your least common denominator, I would go ahead and say, all right, what is 8 divided by negative 1? Well, that's a negative 8. So let's rewrite this as a negative 8 over y minus 2. And look how nice that is now for your denominators. So this is just really dividing this out and just putting the negative there. And then we don't have to worry about it in the denominator. So now we have a common denominator. So our denominator is y minus 2. And so I don't need to change either of these because they have the denominator. So it's just y minus 8, the numerator. All right, so let's keep going on your study guide. And there's some examples in the top. So let's go ahead and go through these examples. And these are just reviewing what we've just done. All right, I'm going to see if it helps to turn a light on here. It's kind of dark, I know. Okay, so let's take a look here. So just doing the exact, these are just problems for you to practice. So if you want to go through and do these problems before and then pause and then you can see if, how you did, do that. That just gives you some extra practice on it. All right, so m minus 1. So what's our, oops, been working out. All right, so what's our denominator here? M minus 1. They both have it once, so we just write it one time. So I don't have to change anything here because I have the denominator, so I just bring that 2m. All right, and then here, same thing. So I'm going to, now this is a little bit tricky, so be careful. So we have a subtraction. So that negative is going to distribute through here. So I think it's smart to put that in parentheses. And if you want to begin by doing it in parentheses, go ahead and do that. Because it's easy to forget that, and I guarantee you students make errors there a lot because they forget to distribute the negative through. So it's kind of tricky there. All right, so that's going to end up giving us 2m. Oh, I gotta change pencils, guys. All right, 2m. And then this distributes through to a negative m, and this distributes to a negative 3. Oh, wow. I don't know what my problem is here. All right, so that is all over m minus 1. Now let's combine like terms up here. So 2m minus m is 1m. I don't have to show the 1. Minus 3. That's what I get here. 2m minus m is this, minus 3, all over m minus 1. And that would be your answer. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this one. So these are just ones that sometimes students get incorrect. That's why I threw them in here. So here, remember that when we find our least common denominator here, we have an x minus 2. Maybe you want to put parentheses around that. So we have an x minus 2. And then here we have an x. And I can write it on this side or this side. It doesn't matter. All right? It doesn't matter where I write it. But what I cannot say is, well, I have an x. Because what you have here is this factor x minus 2. So you have to also bring this x. These are two separate things. All right? And it's kind of hard to remember that. But these are two separate things. So here, what am I missing to get this denominator? Well, I have this, right? I have the x minus 2, but what I don't have is the x. So I'm going to multiply this times x and this times x. So that gives us 9x. Okay, well, what am I missing here? Well, I have the x, but I don't have the x minus 2. So I'm going to multiply times x minus 2. But then I also have to multiply the numerator times x minus 2. Okay, so here, keep in mind, this is a negative 3. So we're going to distribute a negative 3 through. So a negative 3 times x is a negative 3x. Negative 3 times a negative 2 is a positive 6. So here we have 9x minus 3x is 6x plus 6 over x times x minus 2. Now something I want you to look at here. I don't know if maybe I could still cancel something out if I factored this numerator. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. So let's go ahead and what do these both have in common? Well, they have a greatest common factor of 6. So let's take that 6 out. We factored out 6x divided by 6 is x. 6 divided by 6 is 1. And then here we have an x and x minus 2. Well, in this case, nothing does cancel. But we didn't know that necessarily, so I do want you to take it to this step before you're done. All right, so completely simplify it. All right, so here, this is the same thing that we looked at the problem before. So that's going to end up being a negative 1 times x minus 5. Right, we write this first, a negative x plus 5, and then we take the negative 1 out. So go back to the other problem if you need to go through that again. So here, we're going to move this negative. So we're going to move it here. All right, so let's do this to make it a little bit easier. And I'll go ahead and do this too. Okay. So here, I'm going to take this negative divided by this negative. I'm going to rewrite this problem. So 3x for x minus 5. I'm just going to keep parentheses around it. Now, this negative divided by negative 1 is a positive 1. And I really don't have to show the 1. It's there, right? And so now it's just an x minus 5 in the numerator because I divided this and this and it became a positive. Now it's out of the denominator, don't have to worry about it. And now we have this common denominator we can work with. So we have x minus 5. It's once here and once here, so we just write it once here. So we have this denominator, so it's just 3x. I have the denominator, so this is just a positive, so that's just plus 2x minus 25. You can drop the parentheses. It's like multiplying a positive 1 through nothing changes. So combine like terms, so 3x plus 2x is 5x. All right, again, we need to simplify if we can. So we've got to take this one more step. What do these have in common? They have a 5, so let's factor out that greatest common factor. 5x divided by 5 is x. Negative 25 divided by 5 is a negative 5. So now anything that's common in your numerator and denominators, you can cancel out. So the answer is 5. All right. 2 more examples here. So example 4. Notice here we're going to have to factor. So let's go ahead and factor that down. It's nice when this is a 1. So we split the x's. What multiplies to equal 1? Well, 1 times 1. All right, but they need to add up to a negative 2. So that means this has to be a negative 1. This has to be a negative 1 to get us a negative 2. And just double check that I multiply. Negative 1 times negative 1 gives you a positive 1. All right, so there's your factoring there. Here's a difference of squares. So square root of 1, right? 1 times 1. So one's positive, one's negative in any order. So let's see, what is our denominator going to be? Well, we have an x minus 1 and an x minus 1. So it's actually written twice. So we have to write it twice. It's written twice in this one term, right? So that's why we do that. And then down here we have an x plus 1. And we have 1x minus 1. Well, I already show that in there, so I don't have to do it again. I don't have to put a third one on there. You write down the most that it shows up in your denominator in one term. Well, it shows up twice here. So if it shows up only once here, I don't have to write it. I've already shown it in there. All right, so what am I missing here to get this? Well, I have this, and I have an x minus 1, but I don't have an x plus 1. So I'm going to multiply this times x plus 1. That means I multiply the top times x plus 1. So let's distribute. 6x times x is 6x squared. 6x times 1 plus 6x. All right, here, so I have an x plus 1. I have an x minus 1, but what I don't have is another x minus 1. So I'm going to have to multiply this times x minus 1, which means I then have to multiply the numerator times x minus 1. All right, now pay attention with this sign. This is a negative 1 we're going to distribute. So negative 1 times x is a negative 1x, and negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1. All right, so let's come down here, and let's bring our denominator down. And let's combine like terms. So we have a 6x squared. 6x minus 1x is a 5x, and then plus 1. All right, now we don't know if that will factor out so that we can simplify it. So we have to factor it out just to see, because we don't know. Since this is greater than 1, let's use our AC method. So 6 times 1 is 6. I'll just put it over here, is 6. So what are factors of 6 that can give us a positive 5? Well, the only thing that would work for that is 1 and 6. So if I bring 6 and 1, and I need a positive 5, that would have to be a positive 6 and a negative 1. But if I multiply that back together, it gives us a negative 6, not a positive 6. So that one doesn't work. So what about 2 and 3? So if I come over here and I use 3 and 2 and I need a positive 5, what signs would I use? Positive, positive. Now if I multiply that back together, it gives us a positive 6. So that's how I know to use 2 and 3. Okay, I'm kind of going off the paper a little. All right, so we're going to come back over here and we're going to factor this. And I'm actually going to factor it over here so then I can just write the answer when we get over here. So we're going to do 6x squared. We bring down our first term and we're going to replace the 5x with a 3x and a 2x in any order. So plus 3x plus 2x, and then we'll bring down the last term, which is a 1. Okay, now we have 4 terms, so we know we're going to use grouping. So we split it in front of the sign. So what do these have in common? Well, they have a 3x. So if I take 6x squared divided by 3x, that's going to be 2. X squared divided by x is x. Okay, what is 3x divided by 3x? 1. Bring the sign down. Okay, these don't have anything in common, so there's always a 1 in common. So if they don't have anything else, just always bring out a 1. So this is just going to be 2x plus 1. Sorry, kind of running my other paper there. All right, so let's factor out what this has in common and what this has in common, and it's a 2x plus 1. If I take out a 2x plus 1 here, we're left with 3x. If I take out a 2x plus 1 here, we're left with a positive 1. All right, so let's bring that over here to what this factors. 2x plus 1, 3x plus 1, and then in the bottom we have an x minus 1, and an x plus 1. Nothing cancels, but that's okay. It's simplified, and that's where you need to take it to, because we would not have known if something was going to cancel out or simplify. All right, so you got to go there. All right, last one. Let's take a look at this one. Let's go ahead and factor this. Okay, so we're going to factor. My q's are kind of, we have a q and a q, and we need 5. So how about 5 and 1? And how do we get a negative 4, negative 5, positive 1? All right, so first of all, we look for greatest common factor. It'd be nice if I could take a 2 out of there, but we can't. So we're going to have to use the AC method. So 2 times 15 is 30. Factors of 30 that could give us 13. How about 10 and 3? And if we use a negative 10 and a negative 3, that would multiply back to 30, but add to a negative 13. So that's what we want to use. So here, I'm going to do the work. Let me do the work down here. So we're going to bring down the first term. We're going to split this with a negative 10q and a negative 3q, and then plus 15. All right, we're going to split it. So over here, I can take out a 2q, and we're left 2q squared divided by this is q, minus 10q divided by 2q is 5. Okay, bring down this sign, negative. These have a 3 in common, so we're going to take out a 3. All right, so negative 3q divided by negative 3 is a positive q. Positive 15 divided by negative 3 is a negative 5. We're always hoping that these are the same. If they're not, remember it's not factorable. So we'll factor out that q minus 5, and we're left with a 2q minus 3. All right, so over here, this factors out to a q minus 5 and a 2q minus 3. So let's get a least common denominator. We have a q minus 5 and a q plus 1, so q minus 5. Over here, we have a q minus 5, which we've already brought down, and a 2q minus 3. All right, so what do I have? A q minus 5, a q plus 1. What I need is a 2q minus 3. So we'll multiply that by 2q minus 3, which means we multiply the top times 2q minus 3. All right, so q times 2q is 2q squared, q minus 3. Okay. All right, let's look over here. So I have a q minus 5, I have a 2q minus 3. I don't have a q plus 1, so that's what I multiply by. That means I have to multiply the top times a q plus 1. Now notice it's a negative 3. So negative 3 times q is a negative 3q. Negative 3 times 1 is a negative 3. So that leaves us with 2q squared minus 3q is a minus 6q, just adding like terms, minus 3. And then all over our denominator of q minus 5, q plus 1, and 2q minus 3. All right, so we got to factor this just to see if there's anything that we might be able to cancel out. Kind of running out of paper, so I'm going to do the best I can here. All right, so let's go ahead and multiply. We have to use the AC method. So 2 times a negative 3 is a negative 6. So what are factors of a 6 that we can get 6 with? Is there anything that we can get 6 with? Well, we know the factors are 1 and 6. Not worrying about the sign. We can deal with the sign when we figure out the adding and the subtracting. Actually, there's nothing here that I could add or subtract to get 6. It's not multiply. You have to add or subtract to get 6. So neither of those would work. Therefore, this would be your answer, because you can't simplify it down anymore. All right. So that is 6.4. I'm going to get 6.5 out there for you soon. I just want to, we'll be talking about on the online discussion, but I want to make a correction on the syllabus on due dates, just because this is taking a little bit more time. So your 6.4, your 6.5, and your chapter 6 review assignments, which are not posted yet, I'll get those out today. Those are, today being Tuesday the 14th. Those are going to be due on April 24th. All right. Now keep in mind you have exam 4, which is chapter 6, and that's going to change from April 20th to April 24th. So you have that week to take the test, and it will be in the lockdown browser. I'll get that up for you. All right. So if you have some questions, let me know. We have the online discussion. We can talk about it there. All right, guys. Have a great day.